They dragged her into town at dawn. The dust rose first, a fine, gritty promise of what was coming. It coated your tongue before you even saw her, the taste of judgment. In Dry Willow Gulch, they knew how to make a storm out of nothing but whispers, and this morning, the storm had a name, Eliath Granger. The sun was just breaking, painting the town's single, sorry street in shades of soft gold. But there was nothing soft about the sound that shattered the quiet. It started with the clatter of hooves on hard-packed earth, then a sound like something heavy being pulled against its will. A scraping, dragging noise that pulled folks from their homes. They stepped onto their porches, coffee cups still warm in their hands, and they watched. And the first thing they noticed was the silence. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't fighting. Her body was limp, bouncing over the ruts in the road like a sack of grain that had fallen off a wagon. All the fight had been wrung out of her miles ago, out there in the dark where no one was watching. Her hands were bound with a thick, dirty rope, the other end tied to the saddle horn of Deputy Earl's big chestnut horse. He just stared straight ahead, chewing on a piece of straw, his face a mask of bored cruelty. Her dress was torn in ways that made the good wives of the town pull their own shawls tighter, and they yanked their children back behind door frames, their faces a mixture of pity and disgust. Eliaph's face was a ruin, caked with blood and dirt, one eye swollen shut into a purple knot. She was the daughter of a man now sleeping on the far hill with a heavy Bible resting over his cold heart. But his good name couldn't save her now. No one moved to help. They just watched. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, the preacher's wife. Their faces were like stone, hard and unreadable. They were witnesses, and in their silence they were also the jury. Riding behind her, sitting tall and straight in his saddle, was Sheriff Amos Kilroy. His long duster coat was clean, his badge was polished, and a smug little squint tightened the corners of his eyes. He'd given the order that morning. "She ain't to be killed," he'd told his deputy, "just taught. Shame so she don't forget her place. Her crime? A whisper, a rumor. They said she'd been seen down by the river with a Comanche. No names, no proof, just a story told in the dark. But in a town like Dry Willow, a whisper was heavier than law. A whisper could get you killed, or worse. Old Man Taggart, who spent most of his days perched on a whiskey barrel outside the saloon, watched her pass. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "Shame," he mumbled, but not loud enough for anyone to hear. That girl had a quiet heart. He remembered her. 22 years old, used to paint wildflowers on fence posts, used to give her own bread to stray dogs. Kindness was a language this town had forgotten how to speak, but Taggart remembered, and that made him a dangerous man. The dragging didn't stop until they reached the edge of town, right by the faded wooden sign that was supposed to say, "Welcome to Dry Willow Gulch." The CH had fallen off years ago. Deputy Earl pulled his horse to a halt. The sudden stop made Eliaph's body slide a few more feet in the dust. Kilroy swung himself down from his horse, his boots making a dull thud. He walked over, pulled a knife from his belt, and with a single, sharp motion, he cut the rope. She collapsed into a heap, a tangle of torn cloth and bruised limbs. Her wrists were raw, rubbed clean of skin. "She ain't welcome here no more," Kilroy announced to the silent crowd that had followed them. His voice was loud, full of fake authority. "She crosses back into this town, we hang her. Proper." No one said a word. The silence was its own kind of answer. The townsfolk turned and walked back to their homes, their curiosity satisfied. They left her there, a broken thing in the dirt, just outside the welcome sign. She didn't move for a long, long time. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill, pulling the shadows in tight around her. High above, a pair of vultures began to circle, patient and black against the bright blue sky. She was alone. She was broken. She was exiled. But what Sheriff Kilroy and the good people of Dry Willow didn't know was that she wasn't alone at all. From a high canyon ridge overlooking the town, a man watched the whole ugly scene unfold. He saw the dust. He saw the dragging. He saw the hate in their eyes. He'd been watching for hours, his painted horse standing perfectly still beneath him, blending into the red rock of the canyon. He saw them cut her loose. He saw them leave her for dead. His name was Ryder Hallow, and every single person in that town would come to fear that name. He hadn't spoken to Eliath in weeks, not since he saw the preacher's son, Josiah, following them from the river, his eyes filled with a strange, hungry light. Ryder knew then that something terrible was coming. He should have left, taken her with him, but she had roots in that town. She had a father's grave to tend to. Her presence had been like gravity, and he couldn't pull himself away. Now he watched from the ridge. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He didn't move. He didn't ride down. It wasn't time. Not yet. She was alive. For now that had to be enough. He waited. He was good at waiting. He was a hunter after all, and the hunt was about to begin. Back in town, the whispers turned into loud, ugly talk. At the blacksmith's forge, a man claimed she was a Comanche witch. Another man leaning against the general store joked that she'd probably bewitched her own father's cattle, causing them to wander off a cliff last spring. They laughed. It was a cruel, hollow sound. The Reverend Josiah Black, the preacher, said nothing at all. He just stood in his empty church, polishing the wooden pulpit over and over, as if he could scrub away the sin of the town, or maybe just his own. But guilt is a stubborn stain. That night, a storm teased the edges of the sky. Lightning flickered in the distance, silent and pale, and thunder rumbled like an angry giant turning over in his sleep. But the rain never came. The land, just like the hearts of the people in Dry Willow, remained cracked and dry. Out in the dust, Eliath stirred. Thirst. It was a physical thing, a hook in her throat, pulling her back to the world of pain. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone, replaced by a dry, rasping croak. Her hands were swollen into useless clubs. She tried to push herself up, but her arm gave way with a sickening crack. Something inside was broken. She collapsed back into the dirt, a fresh wave of agony washing over her. But the thirst was stronger than the pain. She began to crawl. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged her broken body toward a trickle of muddy water pooling between two rocks. It was warm and tasted of rust, but it was water. She drank, the feeling of it scraping down her raw throat both a torture and a blessing. And that's when she saw him. He was a shadow at first, a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of the canyon trail. He wore no hat. His long, dark hair was pulled back from a face that looked like it had been carved from the canyon rock itself. His eyes were black and steady, and they watched her without blinking. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't from the town. It was Ryder. He didn't make a sound. He didn't move to scare her. He just stood there, a silent sentinel in the twilight. Then he moved. He knelt by a clearer pool of water, cupped his hands, and walked toward her. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way you'd approach a wounded, terrified animal. He knelt in front of her, his knees just inches from her battered face, and he set the water down on the ground before her. She stared at the water in his hands. Then she looked up at him, into those unreadable black eyes. She drank. It hurt to swallow, but the hurt was good. It meant she was still alive. When she looked up again, her vision blurry with tears she refused to let fall. He was gone, vanished back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. She was still alone, but she wasn't helpless anymore. Something had shifted in the dusty air. The vultures had been cheated of their meal. The town had cast her out. But out here in the unforgiving wilderness, she had just found the one thing they never counted on, an ally. The days that followed were a blur of heat and pain, and a strange, quiet kind of care. Memory came in broken pieces, the scorching sun, the throbbing in her arm, the constant, gnawing hunger. And always the same face, appearing at the edges of her world just when she thought she couldn't go on. Ryder never spoke, not a single word, but his silence was different from the silence of the town. Their silence was a weapon, a heavy blanket meant to smother her. His was a shield. His silence didn't judge. It simply was. He would leave things for her on a flat rock near her makeshift shelter, a handful of sweet wild berries, a strip of freshly cooked rabbit meat, a canteen of clean, cool water. He never handed them to her directly. He never got too close. He was giving her space, giving her time to heal, but he was always there, a ghost in the daylight. She started to wait for him, the sound of a displaced stone, the shadow of a hawk overhead. It all meant he might be near. He was a mystery, a man who had loved her from a distance and now protected her from that same distance. Why? What did he want? The questions burned in her mind, but she had no voice to ask them. On the fourth day, she tried to stand. Her legs shook like newborn fawns and her knees buckled. The world tilted, but she caught herself against a rock. Her teeth gritted against the pain that shot up her spine. Her fingers, still clumsy and swollen, went to her lower back. She felt it through the torn fabric of her dress, a patch of skin that was raw, blistered, and hot to the touch. She knew what it was. She had felt the searing heat of it, smelled her own skin burning as the sheriff held the branding iron. He'd pressed it into her flesh while his deputy held her down. A final insult, a mark to carry forever. That evening, she saw the flicker of a fire not far off, a small, controlled flame, tucked away in an alcove of rocks. She limped toward it, her body screaming with every step. Ryder was there. He sat with his back to her, his shirt off. His skin was covered in intricate lines of red and black paint, symbols she didn't understand. A long, sharp knife lay on the ground beside him, gleaming in the firelight. He heard her approach but didn't turn. He just gestured with his head toward a flat stone on the other side of the fire. She lowered herself onto it, the warmth of the fire a welcome relief against the night's chill. He picked up a rough, woven blanket and held it out to her. She took it. It was the first time they had touched something at the same time. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackle of the flames. She stared into the fire, the dancing light reflecting in her one good eye. "They said I was a curse," she whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy thing. He didn't answer. He just kept cleaning his knife, his movements precise and economical. "I didn't mean to love you," she added, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I just did." Still he said nothing, but she could feel his eyes on her now. The weight of his gaze was more real than the blanket around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice barely audible. At that, he finally looked away, his gaze shifting toward the dark rolling hills. "They branded you," he said. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken to her since before. Everything. She flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. "I know." He turned back to her, his black eyes boring into hers. "What does it say?" She couldn't bring herself to speak the word. The shame was a physical thing, a hot coal in her throat. She just shook her head, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. He stood up. He was tall, lean, all muscle and sinew. He walked around the fire and stood behind her. She tensed, her body rigid with fear and uncertainty. What was he going to do? His hand was surprisingly gentle when it touched the small of her back. He pushed the torn fabric of her dress aside. She heard him take a sharp breath. The air grew cold on her exposed skin. "Betrayer," he read aloud. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and final. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for him to pull away, to leave her, to confirm what the town already believed, that she was tainted, unworthy, a betrayer. But he didn't move. His hand remained on her back, his thumb resting just beside the raw, angry letters. His touch wasn't one of pity or disgust. It was something else entirely. It was a silent promise, a declaration of war. "They chose the wrong word," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate right through her. He finally pulled his hand away and walked back to his side of the fire. He picked up his knife. "They should have written survivor." And in that moment, something inside of her that had been broken and bleeding began to knit itself back together. The brand on her skin still burned, but for the first time, she felt a different kind of fire building inside her. Not the fire of shame, the fire of revenge. What the town of Dry Willow didn't know was that they hadn't just created an outcast. They had created a warrior, and her training was about to begin. The days bled into weeks. The angry red of her brand faded to a puckered, ugly scar. The broken bone in her arm began to mend, knitting together with a dull, constant ache. The girl who had been dragged through the dirt was gone, burned away by the sun and the pain. In her place was someone harder, quieter, with eyes that saw everything. Her softness had been scoured away, leaving something like flint behind. Ryder became her silent teacher. He didn't use words, he used actions. He would leave a snare trap, half finished, for her to figure out. He would track an animal and then leave the trail for her to follow. He was teaching her the language of the wilderness, a language of survival that had no room for weakness. One morning he left a bow for her. It was crudely made but strong. Beside it lay a handful of arrows, their tips sharpened stone. There was no note, no instruction, just the tools. The message was clear. You are not a victim. You are alive. Prove it. For days she struggled. The bowstring bit into her wrist, leaving a raw red line. Her arrows wobbled and fell short, burying themselves uselessly in the dirt. She wanted to scream in frustration, to throw the bow against the rocks and give up. But then she would touch the scar on her back, feel the ugly raised letters, and the fire would return. On the fifth day, she drew the string back, her muscles screaming in protest. She focused on a gnarled old juniper tree, took a breath, and let the arrow fly. It flew straight and true, embedding itself in the trunk with a satisfying thwack. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just turned and looked at the ridge where he always watched. He was there, a silhouette against the sky. He gave a single slow nod, and for her it was more than enough praise. That night, as they sat by the fire, she finally broke the silence. Her voice was still rough, but it was steady. They'll come for me again, won't they? Ryder looked up from the arrow he was fletching. His eyes met hers across the flames. Yes. I won't be tied again, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a vow. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next morning he gave her a knife. The blade was worn but sharp as a razor. The handle was made of deer bone, smooth and cool in her hand. She took it, and without hesitating, she pressed her thumb against the edge until a single bright drop of blood welled up. She watched it for a moment, then smeared it down the length of the blade, a blood oath made only to herself. Back in town, the narrative was solidifying. Eliph Granger was dead. Devoured by coyotes, some said. Taken by the Comanche as a prize, said others. Sheriff Kilroy encouraged these stories. He liked the idea of her being a cautionary tale, a ghost story to frighten children and keep women in line. He'd purified his town. He'd cut out the disease. But the disease wasn't gone. It was festering. The preacher, Reverend Black, started to see her face in his congregation. He'd be halfway through a sermon on damnation, and he'd see her, sitting in the back pew, her one good eye staring right through him. He started sweating during his sermons. His hands would shake. His wife thought he was ill, but the Reverend knew better. He wasn't sick. He was haunted. He was haunted by what he knew. And what he knew was far worse than what anyone else in that town suspected. He knew his own son, Josiah, had been obsessed with Eliath for years. He knew Josiah had followed her to the river. He knew Josiah had come home that night with a wild look in his eyes and a scratch on his cheek. The preacher had asked his son what happened, and Josiah had smiled a cold, thin smile. She got what she deserved, he'd said. She chose a savage over me. The Reverend knew his son had lied to the sheriff. He knew Josiah had fanned the flames of rumor into a raging fire, and the Reverend, a man of God, had stayed silent. He had chosen his son over the truth, and that choice was eating him alive. One afternoon, Ryder and Eliath were tracking a deer through a deep ravine. They found the ruins of an old miner's cabin. The roof caved in, the walls slowly surrendering to the wild. Tucked away in a corner, half buried in dirt and debris, was a small, cracked mirror. Eliath picked it up. She wiped the dust away and stared at her own reflection for the first time in weeks. The face that stared back was a stranger's. It was thinner, harder. The bruises were gone, replaced by a permanent watchfulness in her eyes. Her hair was a tangled mess. She turned, lifting the back of her tattered dress, and angled the mirror to see the brand. There it was. Betrayer. The word seemed to mock her from her own skin. A sound escaped her throat. A low, guttural growl of pure rage. With a cry, she hurled the mirror against the stone wall of the cabin. It shattered into 1,000 tiny, glittering pieces. She stood there, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists, staring at the destruction. She hadn't shattered a mirror. She had shattered the girl she used to be. When Ryder found her later, she was sitting by the creek, staring into the water. He didn't ask what was wrong. He seemed to already know. He sat down beside her, not too close, and opened a small leather pouch. Inside were little clay pots filled with pigments: red ochre, black charcoal, a white powder made from crushed bone. He didn't ask for permission. He simply moved behind her and began to paint. His fingers were firm, steady, as they traced ancient symbols across her shoulders, down her arms, over her back. He didn't cover the brand. He incorporated it. He painted around it, turning the ugly scar into the center of a new design, something fierce and beautiful. A symbol of a hawk, its wings spread wide, the brand becoming the body of the bird. He transformed her mark of shame into a mark of power. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She let him draw strength over her pain. When he was finished, he moved back. She stood up, walked to the edge of the creek, and looked at her reflection in the still water. She saw the paint, the symbols, the hawk. She saw the scar. And for the first time, she didn't see a victim. She saw herself. She turned to face him. Her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, something changed between them. The space around the fire seemed smaller. He was cleaning his rifle, and she was sharpening her knife. The silence was comfortable, familiar. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked, her voice soft. "That day, you could have run." Ryder stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He seemed to consider the question for a long time. His answer, when it came, was simple. "Because you didn't." It was the closest he had ever come to saying what was in his heart. And she held on to those words, tucking them away somewhere safe. A few days later, they saw them. 3 riders, moving slowly along the valley floor. One of them was Sheriff Kilroy. They weren't a posse, not yet. They were scouts, testing the waters. Ryder pulled her down behind a cluster of boulders. "They're looking," he said, his voice a low whisper. Elip's hand went to the knife at her belt. Her knuckles were white. "I won't run," she said, her gaze fixed on the men below. Ryder looked at her, at the hard line of her jaw, at the fire in her eyes. He saw the hawk he had painted on her skin, and he saw it in her soul. He nodded. "We won't." But this was just the beginning. Kilroy was getting nervous. The story of her death wasn't holding. A trapper had come into town claiming he'd seen a woman with a bow high up in the canyons, a woman with a face like thunder. Kilroy had dismissed him as a drunk, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The sheriff had a secret, a terrible secret that only he and Eliaf's dead father knew. Her father, a gentle, God-fearing man, had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. He'd found out that Kilroy wasn't just a cruel sheriff. He was a thief. He'd been skimming money from the town's tax collections for years, lining his pockets while the town itself withered on the vine. Eliaf's father had confronted him. He'd threatened to expose him, and 2 weeks later, he was dead. A sudden sickness, the doctor had said, a weak heart. But Kilroy knew the truth. He'd poisoned him, a slow, subtle poison that mimicked a natural illness. He had gotten away with murder. But then Eliaf had gotten close to Ryder. Kilroy couldn't risk it. A girl in love with an outsider, a Comanche no less, was a girl who might not keep her father's secrets. He couldn't kill her outright. That would look too suspicious, coming so soon after her father's death. But he could discredit her. He could ruin her. He could drive her out, brand her a traitor, and ensure that if she ever did speak, no one would believe her. The dragging hadn't been about justice. It had been about silencing her. But he had failed. She wasn't silenced. She was just quiet. And her quiet was getting louder every day. He had to finish what he'd started. He gathered a posse, 8 men, hard men, with rifles and ropes and whiskey on their breath. He told them they were hunting a witch, a traitor, who was consorting with the Comanche to bring ruin upon them all. He promised them a bounty. And as they rode out of town, dust kicking up behind them, Old Man Taggart watched them go from his perch on the whiskey barrel. He took a long, slow drink from his flask. "You damn fool," he muttered to the empty street. "You ain't hunting her. She's hunting you." The hunt began at dusk. Kilroy and his men rode into the canyons, their voices loud and confident, echoing off the rock walls. They were clumsy, arrogant. They thought they were hunting a scared girl. They had no idea what was waiting for them. High above, Eliath and Ryder watched them enter the labyrinth of stone and shadow. They had spent the last week preparing for this. The canyons were their territory now. Every narrow pass, every hidden trail was part of their trap. The first man went down without a sound. He was riding at the back of the group when a rope, stretched taut between two trees, caught him at chest height. He was swept from his saddle, his head hitting the ground with a sickening crack. By the time the others realized he was gone, it was too late. They found him lying in the trail, his neck broken. Panic started to set in. The canyon suddenly felt claustrophobic. The shadows seemed to move. The next trap was a rock slide. Ryder had spent an entire day loosening a section of the cliff face, holding it in place with a single, cleverly cut support beam. As the posse passed below, Eliath, hidden on the opposite ridge, took aim with her bow. Her arrow flew true, striking the support beam and knocking it loose. The rumble started low, then grew to a roar as tons of rock and dirt cascaded down the cliffside. It didn't bury them, but it cut them off, separating Kilroy and three of his men from the rest of the group. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted in confusion and fear. Now they were divided, and they were terrified. Eliath and Ryder moved like ghosts in the fading light. They used the terrain, the echoes, the darkness. A knife thrown from the shadows took another man in the throat. He fell from his horse, gurgling on his own blood. Another rode blindly into a ravine, his horse's legs snapping in the fall. The hunters had become the hunted. The posse was being dismantled piece by piece, without ever laying eyes on their attackers. This wasn't a fight. It was a dissection. By nightfall, only Kilroy and two men remained. They were huddled together, their horses skittish, their eyes wide with terror. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow held a threat. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" Kilroy roared into the darkness, his voice tight with fury and fear. The only answer was the lonely cry of a coyote. But then a voice came from the rocks above. A woman's voice, calm, clear, and cold as ice. "You came to hunt a witch, Sheriff," Eliath called out. "Did you find one?" Kilroy spun around, his pistol drawn, firing blindly into the darkness. The bullets ricocheted off the rocks with angry whines. "I'll see you hang, girl," he screamed. "I'll see you both hang." From another direction, Ryder's voice answered, low and menacing. "You should have killed her when you had the chance, Kilroy. You made a mistake. You let her live." Another shot rang out, not from Kilroy's gun. One of his remaining men cried out and fell to the ground, clutching his leg where an arrow had pierced his thigh. The last man had seen enough. He threw down his rifle, spurred his horse, and galloped madly back the way he came, fleeing into the night. Now it was just Kilroy, alone, wounded and terrified. "What do you want?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "The truth," Eliath answered. "Tell me why you killed my father." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Kilroy froze. How could she know? It was impossible. No one knew. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "You poisoned him," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You thought no one would find out. But my father was a careful man, Sheriff. He wrote things down. He kept a journal." This was a lie. Her father kept no journal. But in the dark, with death lurking in every shadow, Kilroy didn't know that. His mind raced. The journal. Where could it be? "He told me where he hid it," Eliath continued, her voice seeming to come from all around him at once. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to take it to the federal marshal over in Silver Creek." Kilroy's blood ran cold. The marshal. If the marshal saw that journal, he was finished. He had to get it. He had to find it and destroy it. "Where is it?" he demanded, his fear momentarily replaced by desperate greed. "Tell me where it is and I'll let you go. I swear it." "It's buried with him," she said, "under the Bible on his chest." Kilroy's mind fractured. He could see it. The graveyard. The fresh dirt. All he had to do was dig. He had to get that journal. It was his only way out. He forgot about Eliath. He forgot about the Comanche in the shadows. All he could think about was that grave. He scrambled onto his horse and kicked it into a frantic gallop, riding wildly out of the canyons, back toward Dry Willow, back toward the graveyard on the hill. From their hiding place in the rocks, Eliath and Ryder watched him go. Eliath slowly lowered her bow, her knuckles white. Ryder came to stand beside her. "There is no journal," he stated. "No," she said, her eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the sheriff. "But he doesn't know that." She had not only defeated him, she had broken him. She had turned his own guilt and paranoia into a weapon and used it to destroy him from the inside out. He was riding to his own damnation. "What now?" Ryder asked. Eliath looked at him, the firelight from their hidden camp catching the hawk on her back, making it seem as if it were about to take flight. "Now," she said, her voice steady and hard as the stone beneath their feet. "We go back to town. It's time to talk to the preacher." The town of Dry Willow Gulch was drowning in fear. The lone rider who had fled the canyons had brought back a tale of ghosts and shadows, of men picked off one by an unseen enemy. He spoke of Eliaph's voice in the dark, and a Comanche warrior who moved like smoke. The townspeople locked their doors, their fear of the outside world now a palpable thing. They had cast out a demon, and in doing so, had unleashed something far worse. And then the sheriff returned. He didn't ride in tall and proud. He galloped into the center of town like a madman, his eyes wild, his clothes torn. He ignored the questions from the few brave souls who dared to step outside. He rode straight to the church, dismounted, and began hammering on the heavy oak doors of the graveyard, screaming for a shovel. They watched in stunned silence as Sheriff Amos Kilroy, the man who represented law and order, began to desecrate a grave. He clawed at the fresh earth of Eliaph's father's resting place, his fingernails breaking, his hands bleeding. He dug like a man possessed, driven by a ghost and a lie. This was the scene that greeted Eliath and Ryder when they arrived at the edge of town. They didn't ride in. They walked. Side by side, covered in dust, weapons in hand, they walked down the center of the street as the sun began to set. People saw them and scurried back into their homes, peering out from behind curtains. They weren't walking toward the graveyard. They were walking toward the preacher's house. Reverend Black saw them coming from his window. His heart seized in his chest. He knew this day would come. He knew his silence had a price, and the bill was coming due. He met them on his porch. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a reedy whisper. "Your son," Eliath said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her very presence was an accusation. Josiah appeared in the doorway behind his father. His face, usually pale and smug, was twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Get off our property," he sneered. "You have no right." "I have every right," Eliath cut him off. "You lied, Josiah. You watched them drag me, brand me, leave me for dead. And you did it all because I wouldn't have you." "You're a liar and a witch," he shrieked, his composure cracking. "You lay with a savage." "Yes, I did," she said, and for the first time she looked at Ryder, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second. "He showed me more honor in his silence than you have ever shown in your prayers. But that's not why you did it, is it?" She took a step forward. "This isn't about him. It's about what you did that night by the river. You didn't just follow me. You attacked me. You thought you could take what wasn't offered. And I fought you off." She pointed to a faint, thin scar on her cheekbone, almost invisible now. "And I marked you." Josiah's hand instinctively went to his own cheek, where a similar scar, now faded, was hidden by his sideburn. In that single, reflexive movement, he confessed everything. The Reverend stared at his son, his face a mask of horror. He hadn't known the whole truth. He hadn't known it was that depraved. "You told the sheriff I was with a Comanche to cover up your own sin," Eliath continued, her voice rising now, carrying through the quiet street. "You let this whole town condemn me to hide your own shame. You used your father's cloth as a shield for your own evil." From the other end of the street, a commotion started. People were gathering, drawn by the confrontation. At the same time, a roar of fury came from the graveyard. Sheriff Kilroy had reached the coffin. He had pried it open, and he had found nothing. No journal, just his victim, resting in peace. He finally understood. He had been played. With a scream of pure, animalistic rage, he came charging down the street, his pistol in his hand. He saw Eliab, Ryder, and the preacher, and his broken mind saw only one thing, the source of his ruin. He raised his gun, aiming it squarely at Eliab, but he never fired. A shot rang out, but it didn't come from his pistol. It came from the porch of the saloon. Sheriff Kilroy stumbled, a look of surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed on the front of his shirt. He dropped his pistol, staggered a few more steps, and then collapsed into the dust of the street he had ruled for so long. Dead. Everyone turned to see who had fired. Standing on the saloon porch, a smoking rifle in his hands, was Old Man Taggart. He lowered the gun slowly, his face grim. "He was a thief and a murderer," Taggart said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. "And he got what was coming to him." He looked at Eliath. "Your father was my friend. He told me everything, just before he died. Asked me to watch out for you." The whole ugly truth was finally out. The lies had unraveled. The town of Dry Willow stood in the street, bathed in the orange light of the setting sun, and for the first time, they saw their own reflection in the events that had transpired. They saw their silence, their cruelty, their willingness to believe a lie because it was easier than the truth. Josiah, exposed and terrified, tried to run, but Ryder was on him in a flash, tackling him to the ground. The fight was over. The aftermath was quiet. The federal marshal from Silver Creek did come, summoned by Taggart. Josiah confessed to everything, and he was taken away in chains. His father, the Reverend, stripped himself of his title and left town in the middle of the night, a broken man, shamed into exile by his own weakness. The town had to reckon with itself. The brand on Eliab's back was a brand on them all, a permanent reminder of their sin. A few days later, Eliab stood in the graveyard, this time placing a wildflower on her father's restored grave. Ryder stood a respectful distance away. The town was changing. People looked at her differently now, not with fear but with a kind of awe. She was the woman who had been dragged through the dirt and had risen up to cleanse the town that condemned her. She walked over to Ryder, who was holding the reins of 2 horses. "Are we done?" she asked, her voice soft. "Here?" "Yes," he said. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, at the hawk on her skin. "But we're not done." She knew what he meant. They were survivors. They were warriors. And there were other towns like Dry Willow. There were other whispers, other injustices. Their fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. She reached out and took his hand. Their fingers intertwined. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of everything they had been through. "Where do we go?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of land stretching out before them. "Doesn't matter," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "as long as it's forward." They mounted their horses and, without a single look back, rode out of Dry Willow Gulch. They didn't ride as outcasts. They rode as legends. The story of the branded girl and the Comanche ghost would be told around campfires for 100 years. They would say she was a spirit of vengeance, that she was unbreakable. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. She was just a woman who refused to stay broken. A woman who found love in the shadows and strength in her scars. She faced down the very worst of humanity and didn't just survive. She won. The road out of town remembered her. It remembered the dragging, the blood, the pain. But now it would also remember her return. It would remember her standing tall, her head held high, riding toward the sunset, not into an ending, but into a beginning. And that's a story worth telling. It's a reminder that even when you're dragged through the dirt, branded and left for dead, it's not the end. Sometimes it's the spark that lights the fire that will burn down the whole rotten world and let something new, something stronger, grow in its place. If you enjoyed this story, and I know you did, do me a favor. Hit that like button, and for more tales of justice from the shadows, make sure you subscribe. Because out here in the dust, the craziest stories are always the true ones.